Experiment number 7. Time of launch, 3:42. The object is stable. Opening the time rift. This is it. The breakthrough we've been waiting for.
What is this place?
You opened the door, but you didn't know what was waiting behind the threshold.
Sometimes, to save the future, you have to destroy the present.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Pulsar Research Facility stood alone beneath a barren sky of endless storm clouds, its steel frame braced against the biting winds that howled across the icy plateau. It was the kind of isolation that made time itself feel like a foreign concept, a fitting location for humanity's first attempt to unravel the mysteries of temporal space. Dr. Evan Caldwell walked down the observation corridor, his footsteps soft against the reinforced floor. Outside the thick panes of glass, the Arctic horizon stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the harsh peaks of glaciers and the skeletal remains of outposts abandoned long ago. It was beautiful in a cruel, detached way. The cold made it clear. Out here, survival was an afterthought. Progress, however, thrived. In the lab below, his team was already hard at work around the temporal convergence array, a massive ring of shimmering alloy standing upright in the center of the chamber, embedded with crystalline nodules that pulsed with a faint blue glow. The air around the array seemed to hum, vibrating at the edge of human perception. Caldwell, you're just in time. Dr. Malcolm Price, his second-in-command, called from the central console. He was already hunched over the controls, eyes alight with barely concealed anticipation. We're charging the array to 70%. System readouts are stable. Evan nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the growing excitement in his chest. Years of setbacks, sleepless nights, and financial dead ends had led them to this moment. Time travel wasn't a fantasy, it was physics. And today they would prove it. Proceed, Evan said, his voice steady, though his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his headset. Price's hands flew across the keyboard. A low hum filled the room as arcs of blue energy began to ripple along the edges of the ring. The crystals flared, bending light in ways that made the edges of the room seem to ripple. The hum deepened until it became a dull vibration in Evan's chest, resonating through his bones. The lights in the chamber flickered. Then something happened. The air within the ring began to shimmer, as though it were made of liquid glass. A soft distortion took shape, and the background seemed to bend inward. The lab went silent except for the quiet whir of machinery and the gasps of the team as they stared. Within seconds, the shimmer solidified into an image. It was faint at first, like the reflection of a distant memory, but as the distortion settled, they saw it. A vast, dry expanse, cracked soil stretching endlessly beneath a dim and alien sky. Thin black spires jutted from the ground like petrified trees or ruined pylons. The horizon shimmered with waves of heat that blurred the outlines of jagged cliffs in the distance. It's a desert, Dr. Renee Lynn murmured, stepping closer. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, unnoticed. No, Evan squinted. Look closer. The sky overhead was thick with dark clouds, but they weren't clouds at all. They were moving, pulsing, alive. Sheets of some strange organic mass drifted like airborne reefs, tendrils trailing behind them. They undulated as though breathing. The room was deathly quiet as they all stared into the impossible vista. A bead of sweat trickled down Evan's temple, though the room was cold. Then the image shifted. The distortion crackled, deepening until a tear formed in the center, an expanding ellipse of black, raw, and pulsing at the edges. And from that tear, something emerged. At first, Evan thought it was another part of the landscape, a trick of the mind as the desert horizon folded in on itself. But it was moving, stepping forward, slowly, impossibly tall. Its form became clear as it crossed the threshold of the portal. The creature towered at least 12 feet tall, its emaciated frame draped in sinewy skin that seemed stretched too tight over bone. Its arms hung long and crooked, ending in clawed, translucent appendages that shimmered like glass wet with ichor. Its chest was a strange, pulsating mass of segmented bone plates, beneath which something throbbed like a second heart. Its face, or what should have been a face, was an unholy absence. Instead of eyes, nose, or mouth, it had a shifting mass of black orifices that seemed to breathe and whisper at once, emitting a low, guttural vibration that sent nausea rolling through Evan's gut. The team recoiled in terror, some backing into tables and instruments with metallic crashes. Dr. Karen Voss muttered something under her breath. Prayers or curses, Evan couldn't tell. The creature didn't advance further. It stood at the edge of the ring, half in, half out, its elongated silhouette wavering. The whispering grew louder until the room vibrated with the sheer force of it. Evan stumbled, gripping the railing for support as the vibrations coalesced into sound. A voice. No, not a voice. Thoughts. Pressed into their minds like a brand against flesh. Stop. You will shatter the timeline into wounds. We have seen the end, and you caused it. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The words had weight, more than sound, more than meaning. They sank into his very being, twisting his thoughts like a knife until he felt as though his mind might break. The creature raised one of its appendages, almost as if pleading. Its chest cavity split open, revealing layers of glass-like ribs surrounding a glowing mass, a cluster of raw, writhing nerves. Karen let out a scream and bolted for the emergency panel, slamming her hand down to shut off the system. The ring flickered as the portal began to destabilize. The creature's form became hazy, wavering as if caught in a gale of unseen forces. No, don't, Malcolm shouted, rushing to the console. We need more data. Evan grabbed his arm, pulling him back as the distortion erupted in a shockwave that shattered the observation glass. The force hurled them to the floor. Instruments toppled and shattered, and the overhead lights burst in a storm of sparks. When the smoke cleared, the ring was inert, empty. The lab was wrecked. Evan rose shakily to his feet, blinking through the haze of dust and smoke. His ears were ringing. Karen was hyperventilating by the emergency panel. Renee knelt over a bleeding gash on her forehead, and Malcolm was slamming a fist into the floor in rage. Did anyone else hear it? Renee whispered, voice hoarse. Evan swallowed hard, staring at the ring. His heart pounded in his chest. His mind replayed the words, seared into him like an open wound. "We have seen the end." The lab doors hissed open as alarms began to blare. Outside, containment protocols initiated, sealing them off with thick steel barriers. But none of that mattered. They had opened something that wasn't meant to be touched, and something had answered. The emergency lights cast the lab in a sickly red glow. The faint hum of the ventilation system was drowned out by the low warble of the containment alarm, a sound that made Evan's skin crawl. The room was silent but for the labored breathing of the team and the distant echo of automated warnings. They were sealed in, entombed with the aftermath of their failure. Karen Voss was the first to break the silence. "We saw it. We all saw it." Her voice trembled as she pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide and glassy. It wasn't real, right? Just a trick? A projection? Evan shook his head slowly, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. He tried to steady himself, but his legs felt like water. That thing wasn't a projection. His gaze drifted to the array. The ring still stood, its surface inert and dull. But the air around it seemed wrong, as if it had been burned by something invisible. It came from somewhere real. The words lingered, hanging over the room like smoke. Malcolm Price, crouched by the shattered console, spat on the floor, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You're just assuming. You don't know what we saw. None of this proves anything." Karen pointed a trembling finger at him. "It warned us. It showed us something. And it wasn't a damn hallucination." Renee Lynn was seated near the observation railing, a makeshift bandage wrapped around her head. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She spoke without looking up. Did you hear how it spoke? It didn't need words. It injected its meaning into us. Her hands gripped her knees tightly, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. And those visions, I think they were real. The room fell into stunned silence again. Nobody wanted to say it, but they were all thinking the same thing. The creature hadn't merely spoken. It had shown them something, carved it directly into their consciousness like a brand. Then the first monitor flickered. It was a static blur at first, but as they watched, the feed from the external cameras sharpened. The screen displayed the frozen wasteland outside, but something was wrong. The familiar landscape of jagged cliffs and snowdrifts was obscured by a shifting haze, a slow-moving distortion that rippled across the screen like an oil slick in the air. The distortion deepened, widening like an infection in the sky. Then the vision returned, not from the monitors, but directly into their minds. The room fell away, replaced by something vast and terrible. They were no longer themselves, just witnesses bound to the moment. They stood in the middle of a broken world. The sky overhead was cracked and dim, pulsing with strange reddish light. The black, writhing masses they had seen earlier now filled the heavens, enormous and alien, like a reef of living, organic storms. Tendrils of shimmering tissue spiraled downward from the sky, anchoring themselves to what remained of the earth below. The ground was fissured and scorched, studded with ruined cities reduced to skeletal remnants of concrete and metal. Rivers of molten, viscous sludge wound through the wreckage, reflecting the dull glow of the sky. And the people, if they could even still be called that, wandered aimlessly through the ruins. They were elongated, their forms stretched as though caught between multiple timelines. Flesh drooped from their bones in looping strands of sinew, and their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes liquefied into glistening hollows. Some stumbled forward on malformed limbs, while others fused into grotesque masses of writhing muscle and exposed bone. There was no humanity left in their movements, just the slow, agonized persistence of something that could not die but no longer lived. A great shadow moved across the horizon, a living monolith, its segmented body glistening with translucent plates. Its limbs, far too many to count, stretched high into the sky like the roots of an impossible tree. Each step caused the ground to split and tremble, spreading fissures that bled a sickly, luminous ichor. Its surface writhed with shapes that looked almost human, pressing and clawing against the translucent flesh from within. The vision shifted again. Now they stood on the edge of a massive abyss. Below, entire continents had caved in, forming an endless writhing pit filled with organic tendrils that thrashed and writhed like nerve endings. And at the center of it all, there was a structure, something ancient and alien. A single massive spire, cracked and broken, with veins of glowing white light running through it. They could feel its presence pressing into their minds, as though it were alive and waiting. Then came the whisper again, low, agonized, and undeniable. This is your gift to the future, a wound that will never heal. The vision shattered like glass. Evan stumbled to the floor, gasping for breath. His chest felt like it was being crushed. The others lay sprawled or hunched over, clutching their heads. Renee let out a dry sob, her fingers curled into tight fists. Karen was the first to speak, her voice a raw whisper. "We did this." Evan forced himself upright, his thoughts a tangled storm of disbelief and terror. "No," he muttered, shaking his head as though denial could rewrite reality. "That future, whatever it was, hasn't happened yet. We can stop it." Malcolm shot him a venomous glare, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "You don't know that. Whatever that was could have been a lie, an illusion to make us stop. We're standing on the edge of a breakthrough. This is what happens when you stare into the unknown. And what if it's not?" Karen's voice cut through his tirade like a scalpel. What if that thing was telling the truth? What if our breakthrough destroys everything? The room was filled with the weight of the unanswerable. The monitors buzzed with static again, the outside feed cutting to black. Then, as if in response, the distortion returned, centered on the far end of the chamber. A pinpoint of darkness expanded outward, forming another fissure in the air. This time, it wasn't one figure. There were 5. The first was shaped like the original entity, but smaller, its arms lined with glowing veins that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. The others were stranger, bodies split asymmetrically, their torsos stretched into multiple segments. Limbs sprouted from impossible places, twitching and undulating, as though disconnected from themselves. They moved slowly, their long, crooked fingers raised in the same motion of warning. The whisper returned, stronger this time, enough to rattle the glass fragments on the floor. "We were born from your mistake. The wounds spread, and now they bleed backward." Evan felt a chill deeper than fear, a hollowing sensation that left him weightless and sick. The creatures raised their limbs in unison, and with a final pulse of distorted air, the fissure collapsed, leaving only the silence of a sealed tomb. Karen sat against the wall, clutching her temples. Malcolm was trembling with rage, but even he had no words. Renee's breath was shallow, her eyes dull. Evan stared at the ruined lab, at the scorched remnants of the array. His heart pounded like a war drum as a single, unrelenting thought took hold. They had been warned. But what terrified him the most wasn't the warning. It was the growing certainty that Malcolm would ignore it. The containment seals groaned as the pressure regulators fought to stabilize the atmosphere inside the lab. The room reeked of burnt metal, ozone, and something else, something faintly organic, like wet decay. No one spoke. The events of the last hour had turned their groundbreaking experiment into a nightmare. Evan Caldwell stood near the remnants of the temporal convergence array, his eyes locked on the scorch marks along the metal ring. It looked like a relic from some forgotten war, charred, twisted, and dead. Yet, beneath the silence of the lab, he swore he could still hear a faint hum, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of static. His pulse pounded in his ears as he replayed the creature's warning. "We were born from your mistake." The words felt like razors beneath his skin. Malcolm Price, however, was pacing near the emergency console, his face twisted with fury and desperation. "We're wasting time," he snapped, his voice cutting through the silence. He slammed his fist into the nearest terminal. "You're all acting like frightened children. Whatever this was, it's not a prophecy. It's interference. A trick." Renee Lynn, sitting pale and shivering against the far wall, didn't even look up. "A trick," she muttered, her voice hollow. "Malcolm, you saw it. We all saw it. The future was dying. People, us, twisted into things." She trailed off, unable to finish. Malcolm whirled on her. "And you think the solution is to stop? To shut everything down and pretend this never happened? That's not how science works." He jabbed a finger toward Evan. "We're standing on the edge of the greatest discovery in human history. If we back down now, all of this, everything we've sacrificed, means nothing." Evan met his gaze, his voice calm but edged with exhaustion. "What if that's exactly what needs to happen?" Malcolm froze, incredulous. "I don't think you get it," Evan continued, stepping forward. "We didn't just open a door. We ripped something apart, and now it's bleeding. You saw what's waiting on the other side." Malcolm's face darkened. "What I saw was fear. Yours." He turned back to the console, his fingers moving furiously across the interface. "If we stabilize the rupture, we can force it to stay open long enough to understand what's happening. If we can map the temporal fault lines..." "No." The word came like a gunshot. Malcolm stopped typing, his shoulders stiffening. Evan moved closer, forcing himself to remain steady. "If you try to open it again, you'll kill us. And not just us, everyone." Malcolm turned slowly, eyes wild. "You've lost your nerve." Karen Voss stood abruptly, her face pale but determined. "Evan's right." She took a shaky step forward. "I wanted this project to work more than anyone, but you're not thinking clearly, Malcolm. None of us are. Those things, they're real. They're not just echoes or warnings, they're consequences. For a moment, something flickered in Malcolm's eyes. Uncertainty, fear, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold resolve. "You're all cowards," he muttered, turning back to the console. Evan lunged forward, grabbing Malcolm's arm. "Don't!" Malcolm shoved him back with surprising strength. Evan stumbled but kept his footing. "Get out of my way," Malcolm shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not letting fear stop this." His hands flew across the controls, bypassing the fail-safes. The room lights dimmed as the power surged into the damaged array. "Malcolm, stop!" Renee cried, struggling to her feet. The array began to hum again, louder this time, a deep, resonant vibration that made the floor shudder. The ring glowed with an eerie, unstable light. Sparks erupted from the conduits as the system strained under the stress. Evan rushed forward, but before he could reach the console, the air above the array split open like a wound. A jagged ellipse of blackness bloomed in the center of the ring, twisting and expanding with unnatural speed. The lab was bathed in pulsing, sickly light as the rupture stabilized, larger than before. A chorus of whispers filled the room, overlapping and discordant. And then the first creature stepped through. It was smaller than the previous ones, its form more humanoid, though its limbs were far too long. Its skin shimmered, translucent and wet, revealing intricate layers of muscle and bone beneath. Where its face should have been, there was only a smooth, reflective surface that shimmered with fractal patterns. Behind it, more figures emerged, their bodies twisted as they passed through the rift, like clay reshaped mid-stride. Some were headless, their torsos segmented into pulsating ridges. Others dragged distorted limbs that oozed viscous amber fluid. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spread along the metal floor, and every breath came out as a cloud of vapor. The lead creature raised an arm, long, jagged, and lined with spindly protrusions, and pointed at Malcolm. Evan barely had time to shout before the creature lunged. Its appendage extended with impossible speed, latching onto Malcolm's back. He screamed, a high, ragged sound that sent chills down Evan's spine. The creature's arm pulsed, muscles contracting as the limb fused into Malcolm's spine. His body convulsed, his legs buckling. Black veins spread across his skin like cracks in porcelain. His mouth opened in a soundless wail as his torso began to invert, his ribcage folding outward, exposing his lungs and heart as his body twisted in on itself. "Malcolm!" Karen's scream was hoarse and desperate, but there was nothing she could do. Malcolm collapsed to the floor, his body a grotesque mass of bone, muscle, and torn fabric. The creature let out a low, guttural hum as it retracted its limb, the viscera still clinging to its appendage. The rupture pulsed again, widening. "We have to shut it down," Renee shouted, rushing to the console. Her hands trembled as she typed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I can overload the stabilizer, collapse the rift before more come through." Evan nodded, his throat tight. "Do it." Karen moved to help, but the creatures began to advance, their elongated forms flickering with temporal distortions. Evan grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it with all his strength at the nearest creature. The impact sent a jolt through his arms, but the creature barely staggered. Its reflective face flickered, showing warped glimpses of Evan's own terrified expression. Renee's fingers flew over the keys. Almost there! A deafening crack split the air as one of the creatures lashed out, sending Evan sprawling. His head struck the floor, and stars exploded behind his eyes. Karen grabbed the emergency power lever and pulled it down. The lab lights flared, and the array surged with energy. The rupture began to collapse in on itself, the air distorting and folding like shattered glass. The creatures let out a collective howl, a sound that was both alien and mournful. One by one, their forms unraveled, collapsing into streams of luminous particles that dissipated into the void. The rupture imploded, sending out a concussive shock wave that knocked them all to the ground. When the dust settled, the array was dark, silent. Evan coughed, his lungs burning. The room was in ruins, charred walls, shattered instruments, and the remnants of Malcolm's twisted body. He felt a wave of nausea but forced himself to stand. Renee was slumped over the console, blood trickling from her nose. She was alive but barely conscious. Karen knelt beside her, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed. Evan stared at the ring, his chest tightening with the weight of what they had done. The rupture was closed, but at what cost? The whispers were gone, but something deeper remained, a silence that felt like a wound. They had stopped the experiment, but they all knew the truth. The future was still watching. The lab was dying. Smoke coiled in the air, thick with the acrid stench of charred circuits and blood. The once pristine walls were scorched black, lined with fractures like the ribs of a collapsed chest. The temporal convergence array stood in ruin, its metal frame warped into something unrecognizable, twisted as though screaming in its death throes. Evan Caldwell stood in the center of the devastation, his knees trembling beneath him. His vision blurred as sweat and blood trickled down his brow. Renee Lynn sat slumped near the main console, barely conscious, her breaths coming in shallow wheezes. Karen knelt beside her, whispering something soft, though her eyes betrayed the truth. They all knew it was the end. A faint vibration pulsed beneath the floor, rhythmic and slow, a tremor that resonated deep in the bones. The rupture was gone, but its scar lingered, etched into the very air. Evan could feel it, that same wrongness, like a shadow standing just behind him. Karen's voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. "It's not over, is it?" Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. She knew the truth as well as he did. The rupture had sealed, but the damage was already done. The timeline was bleeding, fraying at the edges. Whatever they had let in, whatever they had created, it was still spreading. Renee coughed, her body convulsing weakly. Evan dropped beside her, cradling her as she blinked up at him through half-lidded eyes. "Did we stop it?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Evan nodded, though the words felt like poison in his throat. "We bought time." Her cracked lips curled into the ghost of a smile, but the light in her eyes was already dimming. "That's enough." Her breathing slowed, then stopped. Karen let out a quiet, broken sob, her hand covering her mouth. Evan stared down at Renee's still face, willing himself to believe that she had found some peace. But the silence was deafening. Evan placed her gently on the ground and rose, his legs stiff and unsteady. Karen reached for his arm, but he shook his head. "Stay here," he said softly. Her brow furrowed. What are you doing? He didn't answer as he moved toward the backup power panel. The lights overhead flickered weakly, the last embers of a dying flame. Evan opened the hatch, revealing the complex lattice of circuits and wires that controlled the core. Karen's breath caught as realization dawned. No, Evan, no. You can't. It's the only way. His voice was calm now, resolute. She scrambled to her feet, swaying as though the weight of the moment was too much. We'll figure out something else. We always do. There's nothing left to figure out. He met her gaze, his eyes steady despite the storm raging inside him. The rupture may be closed, but it's still unraveling everything. We can feel it. It's in the air, in us. He gestured to the wreckage around them. This place is a wound, and there's only one way to seal it. Karen shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. We can't lose you. I can't. Evan stepped forward and took her hands in his. She was shaking. So was he. You won't lose me, he whispered. Not really. She tried to speak, but the words crumbled into silence. Evan turned away and began reconfiguring the core's failsafe. The process was simple in theory. Redirect the energy, force a full system collapse. The implosion would consume the facility, wiping out every trace of the experiment and the timeline contamination. There was no coming back from it. Karen's voice cracked behind him. You don't have to do this alone. Evan froze for a moment. He wanted to turn around, to tell her everything he'd never said. But the truth pressed into his mind like a blade. He had to see this through. I started this, he said quietly. Let me finish it. The core began to hum as the overload sequence initiated. The floor vibrated beneath his feet, the temperature rising as the system built toward critical mass. The console flashed warnings in harsh red light. Countdown. 2 minutes to detonation. Karen stood at the edge of the lab, tears glinting in her eyes. She clutched the railing as though it were the only thing keeping her from running to him. Evan. He looked up at her one last time, his heart breaking under the weight of her voice. He managed a small, weary smile. Get clear, Karen. She hesitated, then nodded, swallowing hard. You better be right behind me. I will be. It was a lie they both chose to believe. Karen turned and sprinted toward the exit. Evan watched her go until the thick steel doors sealed shut behind her, leaving him alone. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of everything settle over him. The hum of the core grew louder, rising into a deafening crescendo. The room shook violently, consoles bursting in showers of sparks. The rupture, silent but present, flickered like an afterimage in the air. Evan felt the pull of it, something vast and unknowable pressing against the seams of reality. For a moment he thought he saw shapes moving within the static, twisting, writhing things with hollow faces. They didn't speak this time. There was nothing left to say. Evan closed his eyes. He thought of the first day he set foot in the facility, the snow crunching beneath his boots, the thrill of possibility, the hope that they could reach across time and grasp something greater than themselves. But some things weren't meant to be touched. The final seconds ticked down. As the core reached critical mass, Evan whispered one last thought, "Forgive me," before the room was consumed in white light. Outside, Karen stumbled into the snow, the frigid air biting her skin. She collapsed to her knees as a muffled roar echoed beneath the ground. The earth trembled. Then, in a brilliant flash, the pulsar research facility was gone. A pillar of searing light shot into the sky, then imploded inward, collapsing in on itself until there was nothing left but silence. Karen stared at the empty horizon, her breath ragged in the cold. She waited for something, some sign, some whisper in the air. But there was only stillness. Her tears froze against her skin, but she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she whispered his name to the wind, over and over, until the words broke. The future had been rewritten. But at what cost? Years later, they found her journal buried beneath layers of snow at an abandoned outpost near the site. The final entry read, "We tried to save the future." I hope it was enough. Some sacrifices will never be remembered, but they shaped everything that followed. I see him sometimes, in dreams, in the quiet. His name will echo long after I'm gone. Below the entry was a single faint phrase, burned into the page by some unseen force. The timeline is whole.